Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Forian-Zytynsky, and I lead government relations for Keurig Dr. Pepper Canada. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today. Bittersweet moment. As Catherine mentioned, it's the third and final day of the TGF, but as they say, all good things must come to an end. But before I begin my remarks, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and congratulate the Rémillard family. Gilles, Marie, Nicholas, 30 years of commitment to building this institution, these conferences from Montreal to Paris, Miami to Buenos Aires, Phoenix, Arizona too, and of course, Toronto. So thank you, not just to them, but to the entire International Economic Forum of the Americas team. A round of applause for them, please. Now, let me share a little about who we are at Keurig Dr. Pepper. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our iconic products, whether it's Keurig coffee makers and K-Cup pods, the #1 brewing system in Canada, or powerful brands like Dr. Pepper, Canada Dry, Mott's Clamato, and Snapple. As the third largest beverage producer in North America and the largest coffee producer in Canada, we boast more than 120 owned, licensed, and partner beverage brands, including over 70 right here in Canada. But there's more to our company than just great beverages. Sustainability is deeply ingrained in everything we do. It's in our DNA. And it's not just a priority, but the very purpose of our business. That means that every day we strive to make a positive impact with every sip. Whether it's reducing our environmental footprint, responsibly sourcing key ingredients, or supporting the communities where we operate, our commitment to sustainability touches every aspect of our work. At Keurig Dr. Pepper, we're constantly looking for ways to innovate and improve, and we take pride in having made our operations more sustainable, from increasing the use of recycled content in our packaging to responsibly sourcing our coffee. Our commitment to the coffee business is crucial, as the world drinks over 3 billion cups of coffee a day. That's a lot of coffee. And more than 100 million families depend on the coffee industry for their livelihoods. However, climate change threatens their future, and rising temperatures are affecting the coffee belt. Coffee farms are moving to higher altitudes for cooler climates, but space is limited. Scientists expect that climate change will cut in half the area where coffee can be grown by 2050. At Keurig Dr. Pepper, we've been addressing these challenges head-on for decades. Through partnerships with organizations like World Coffee Research, Root Capital, and Ecosierra, we're investing in developing coffee varieties that are more resilient to climate change, supporting farming practices that improve soil health and biodiversity, and by helping coffee farmers implement innovative solutions and effective governance. One fact we're incredibly proud of: in 2013, for the 14th year in a row, Keurig Dr. Pepper was the world's #1 purchaser of fair trade coffee. But it doesn't stop there. I'm excited to share our latest innovation in single-serve coffee. We recently announced the introduction of our new plastic-free and aluminum-free pods, K-Rounds, along with a new brewing system, the Keurig Alta, that will launch in 2025. Our K-Rounds consist of pressed coffee grounds wrapped in a protective plant-based coating to preserve the wonderful flavor and aroma while eliminating the need for plastic or aluminum. K-Rounds represent a revolution in single-serve coffee. We're breaking traditional constraints of pod design to provide consumers with sustainability-focused solutions that don't compromise on convenience or flavor you expect from Keurig. In closing, I'd like to highlight the crucial role that international trade and collaboration play in addressing challenges and opportunities we face in the global coffee supply chain. From farmers in the coffee belt to businesses and consumers worldwide, the coffee industry is a prime example of just how interconnected our global economy truly is. With that in mind, we welcome back to the Toronto Global Forum the Honourable Mary Ng, Minister of Export Promotion, International Trade and Economic Development. We're honoured to have her here with us today to share her insights and vision for the future. So please join me in welcoming Minister Ng, along with Mr. Giles Gherson, President and CEO of the Toronto Regional Board of Trade. Enjoy the show.
Well, Mary, it's great to have you. I was going to call you minister. I'm former deputy minister. I feel I should always call a minister, but you've told me to call you Mary, so I will. We'll be informal. Now, I think the best way to start this off is really thinking a bit about the trade landscape, because you've been Minister of International Trade and Export Promotion for pretty much 6 years now, which is a long time in politics. right? So you've seen the land, you've gone through COVID, pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID. The geopolitics has changed enormously. Economies have changed. It's a very different world. So give us a little bit of a sense from your perspective of the changed landscape, what you're noticing, what really strikes you about the trade landscape today.
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's terrific to be back at Toronto Global, and as Michael and Catherine was reading the list of where Toronto Global and sort of just global has been, I was sort of thinking, check, I was there, right, Nicola? Check, I was there. Check, I was there. So it's really, really terrific to be back on this stage and to have this really good conversation with you, Giles. I think the one thing I've noticed, particularly in the Canadian context, is just how resilient businesses are. You spoke about COVID and what businesses had to go through during that period. And we, of course, the federal government did just an enormous array of things to actually help businesses at that time. And the reason I'm actually talking about that is because it's directly connected to how resilient businesses are today and how quickly I think Canadian businesses have bounced back into the trading arena. And I was reflecting on this conversation, and I remembered that during COVID, one of the things we had to do, one of the things we decided to do, and to innovate a little bit in that time, which I think many businesses did around the world. But as the trade minister, we actually had trade missions planned, and then the world shut down, and then we thought, how are we going to deal with that? And I think this goes back to the resilient point, because even during COVID, we tried. And I remember saying to the team, I said, look, let's just try. And if nothing works, then who cares? Like, we have to just see whether or not we could support businesses where they are today, which was at that time in COVID. So we ended up running virtual trade missions to places like France, to countries in Africa, to the Caribbean, to South Korea, in a virtual world. That, I think, coupled with the enormous supports that the Canadian government provided to businesses, and then the economies opening up as they are, and today the competition that is happening globally, the geopolitical situation that's happening globally, I think Canadian businesses are particularly well positioned because they are resilient. So small and medium-sized businesses are growing into these markets. They are heading into they are joining trade missions. You and I will talk a little bit more about that and how the Trade Accelerator program helps that. But I think my reflection really is that Canadian businesses and entrepreneurs have become extremely resilient. They are looking for opportunities in those global supply chains and value chains. They are seeing that Canada is the dependable, reliable country because of our rules-based system that's attracting investment in the way it is, and therefore it's giving them a lot of confidence. So while you could sort of open the papers at any given day and see or feel a sense of just global uncertainty perhaps, I would say that for Canadian businesses in particular, it's that resiliency that I see coming through, and that I think is also getting noticed globally of the Canadians in this room and certainly across this country as they enter into some of those international markets.
I mean, that's really good to hear. I mean, maybe on two counts. One is that typically we have smaller companies in the U.S., right? We, our neighbors to the south, and it's often harder for smaller companies to export. There's more of their resources are required to export. So it's great that you talk about the resilience that you did. The other thing is, though, the sort of trade liberalization, which really does, open the papers every day and you get the sense of a rising tide of protectionism, blocks forming, and we're a very trade-dependent country. We've always relied on the multilateral trade system, sort of collective security, if you can call it that, as to ensure that borders remain open. But this, probably for the last decade now, we've been seeing this sort of ratcheting back in the U.S. itself, but also around the world. What's your sense of that? Because we used to talk about the WTO, for example, as being the guardian of the multilateral free trade system. Nobody talks about WTO anymore.
I do.
You do. Good. Let's talk about it.
Well, let me just set the context. I mean, you're absolutely right. Canada is a small country. We're 40 million people. We're the size of California. We are a trading nation. And despite being 40 million people, we are the 10th largest economy in the world. 1 out of 6 jobs in Canada is dependent on trade, and 3.3 million jobs in Canada are supported through trade and employed largely by small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada. So you're absolutely right. We have to depend on rules working, and we have to be at the table to create those rules, be a part of designing those rules. And we also have to be at the table at helping to reshape some of those rules as well. The reason I talk about the WTO is because Canada, through our work and through our leadership called the Ottawa Group, has been working with a whole number of countries around the world, like-minded colleagues and trading partners, where the rules and how we might reform and play our part in reforming the WTO matters to our economies. I'll give you a tangible example of how that manifests. Coming out of the pandemic, we saw shocks like export restrictions coming up, no notifications being given, and you'll remember at that time it was really critical that life-saving medicine and supplies would move around the world. Well, that's trade rules, right? I mean, so if you have an export restriction by some countries and not others, and if you and today you're not making any product without having some kind of input in that value chain or supply chain anywhere in the world. So the Ottawa Group looked at what we were experiencing, came together and actually, worked among the Ottawa Group to create a set of rules that actually will deal with trade and emergencies, health emergencies.
Set of rules.
Exactly. Yeah. But what we did there was we did the work in Canada with our partners in the Ottawa Group, and then we workshopped it across the multilateral system. And look, you need full consensus to get it passed at the WTO, and we did at the 12th ministerial a couple of years ago. That's an example of how Canada has to be a part of creating those rules. And today, Canada is still the only G7 country with a comprehensive free trade agreement with every other G7 country. That's really good. It's really good because it gives predictability and certainty to Canadian businesses who are looking to either invest here or invest in, with our trading partners. And they can count on mechanisms like dispute settlements in those trade agreements. And if you look at what Canada has access to, it's enviable, which is why partnering with Canada is about partnering not just with Canada, but it's through Canada and to the rest of the world. We have access to 65% of the world's economy through our free trade agreements. Here in North America, everyone's really familiar with CUSMA. We call it that in Canada. Used to be called NAFTA. You would call it USMCA.
Let me call it next time.
I hope CUSMA still. And then, and agreements like the one we have with European Union. I was just in Brussels 2 weeks ago. We sold over $1 billion of water bombers to the EU, to 6 member states, to the European Union. That is trade working in real commercial and investment terms. But we count on these rules. We have to keep doing our work, being at the table, and to make sure that the values that are really important to Canadians, whether it's protecting workers, to make sure that Canadian workers get paid well and that they benefit through trade, and that we are fighting climate change and having really strong environmental provisions, which quite candidly makes Canada super competitive. But that's the environment we live in. But that's why our agreements are as strong as they are, and why many businesses and investors will say to me, that's what they rely on us. I'm the government, so I don't do business. Many of you in this room as business leaders do. But it's my job to set the table and to create the right conditions.
So one of the things when I was Deputy Minister of Trade in the province of Ontario, one of the things that aggravated me was when our minister was like you, going to travel, to take trade missions and so on. I always had the uncomfortable experience of looking at going to Mexico, going to wherever, and you'd look at the trade balance and you say, okay, how much are they importing? How much are they importing from us, and how much are we importing from them? And almost everywhere I looked, we had a trade deficit, and it always sort of bugged me a little bit. We call ourselves the great trading nation, and apart from the U.S., where we are in balance, almost everywhere else we're in imbalance. And I wondered whether we took full advantage of the portfolio of trade agreements that you talked about. So we have all these agreements, but I often wonder whether we're strategically focused. One last point on this, which is I remember when CETA was signed, the European Trade Agreement was signed, and all of a sudden you walk into a grocery store in Ontario and there's British cheese everywhere, and you realized they had focused on the opening of the dairy quotas here, and they came in they really came in and they really grabbed a chunk of the market. And I thought, do we do that? When we sign trade agreements, do we kind of focus on strategically and say, we can take real advantage in these one or two sectors and make real gains?
So that, at the very heart, has been the job the Prime Minister has given to me. My portfolio has been the Minister of Small Business and Export Promotion and International Trade. My portfolio now is international trade, export promotion, and economic development. And you're completely right. We needed to do a better job at helping our businesses and our entrepreneurs take that leap to get into those international markets. So I often would say it's terrific that we've got these trade agreements. So what if we aren't going to be able to get the utilization of them the way we do? So when I now look at, when I do a free trade commission with the EU, which I do every year, it's sort of it's our version of the AGM with my trading partner. Every single line has increased, but that's great. The Americans, you're right, we've always done very well in a balanced way. I mean, Canada is the top customer for over 35 of the American states. But in places where, like the CPTPP, so in countries like Japan and Singapore and Australia, New Zealand, that make up that agreement, trade diversification is a key part of my job. And working with my colleagues around the cabinet table around economic development, so regional economic development that helps to grow Canadian enterprises domestically with a view for them to go abroad and enter those markets. That's the job. That's my KPI. How can I help Canadian companies grow not only domestically with my colleagues, but also into the international market? And you and I have been collaborating, you being the Toronto Board of Trade, but also many of those across the country. It's one thing to say, let's help, let's open up the doors, let's encourage businesses to diversify.
The tools.
That isn't enough. You need the tools. Yep. So we have made, millions and millions of dollars of investments working together on a program that was developed by business for business to trade, so that we've now taken, over 2,500 businesses, 3,000 businesses through that program. So it's intentional, development of their capability to learn the skill set, and for us to put our toolkit in front of them so that they can actually have the tools to do trade. So it would be how to access, the BDC on financing, export development financing and insurance. How do the trade commissioners work with them in a way to help them understand a market, penetrate a market, get into a market? Coming with me on trade missions, particularly into the Indo-Pacific, but other regions, right? So it's intentional investments to grow Canadian companies and intentional investments to give them the tools and to have those federal toolkits along with our provinces and territories and the municipalities and the economic development organizations, and really working as Team Canada in order to move the dial. And the dial is helping Canadian businesses, but not the big ones, really.
Small.
It's the small and medium-sized businesses to actually prime them so that they can grow. And when they grow, then think about it locally. Think about it in every part of the country. It is economic development in their regions, but they're doing that as Canada would as a trading country by accessing customers and growing and generating revenue specifically through trade. So it takes more than signing an agreement.
Absolutely.
It's signing an agreement, committed to diversification, making the investments to support our small and medium-sized businesses, doing trade missions, developing the relationships with those partners around the world who are our trading partners, and creating conditions so that our businesses can flourish in those markets.
Well, that's very well said. And just so people know, it's the Trade Accelerator program.
Yes.
So a bit of a plug for the Toronto Region Board of Trade. As Mary said, the Vancouver Board of Trade, Calgary, Edmonton, Halifax, Montreal, also part of this program. But it comes out of here, out of Toronto Region Board of Trade, in close association, obviously, with your department. And it's cool because it's a 6-week program for small businesses, and you have to produce an export plan at the end of the 6 weeks.
I'm looking at the dashboard that you produce. 60% of revenue growth is experienced by companies 2 years after participating in the program. They're in 80 countries, and there's 8.5 jobs created per company out of and these numbers are old because you said 3,000, this is 2,500. But that's so we are tracking efficacy in a real way. So I know it works.
Yep.
And back to your question, which is, you sign these agreements, do we know if businesses and Canadian businesses are really going to be able to take advantage of it? I think that there is still lots and lots to do. I mean, it's great to be able to do, a $1 billion sale to the EU and to 6 member states, water bombers by de Havilland. But think about how many small and medium-sized enterprises it would take to do the same kinds of transactions. But that's what this program is doing, along with.
But the big deals are important deals because I think they signify to other markets what we're capable of doing. Right? They send a signal. Canada does water bombers. We at the Board of Trade, we're very heavily focused on the energy transformation, the nuclear resurgence. Here, and the possibility now of significant revival of nuclear exports, for example, from Ontario. So
I have to give a shout out to the former minister, Seamus O'Regan over there, who actually started doing that work on nuclear.
Yeah, well,
he's going to kill me for doing that, but I couldn't help it, Shame. Sorry.
But that's exciting stuff. And it tells the world that we have a product. And when you know what we do, then you're inclined to buy other things. Before we talk a bit about, in the few minutes we have left, because you've been putting a lot of emphasis on Indo-Pacific and ASEAN, which are hugely growth markets and very important for us to be there. But I want to come back to the U.S. for a sec, because obviously, we have November 5th upon us, the U.S. election. It seems to be a bit of a toss-up now, but almost irrespective of who wins the White House, we are seeing a bit of a rise in more than a bit, a significant rise in sort of protectionist sentiment in the U.S. And we still sell about 80% of our 80% of our exports are destined for that market. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister say, if it's former President Trump, we're ready. What does that mean, though? I mean, it's good to hear that we are, but I have to say, I think a lot of us probably in this room are a little worried about, and it doesn't matter almost who there's, we are going to, if we see tariffs, I think that's devastating for us. If we see the imposition of 10% tariffs or more, but as well, we've seen significant subsidies from the Democratic administration that really have pulled a lot of investment south from Canada. So what is your sense of how to play the next 4 years?
Well, so the Prime Minister is right. We are going to be ready. Minister Champagne, who was here yesterday, myself, Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Ambassador Hillman, we have been working on a Team Canada engagement since the beginning of this year in a very, very intentional way. The Prime Minister tasked us to do this. And the purpose of that work is really to make sure that we are working with Canadian businesses, labor organizations, stakeholders, civil society groups, and our counterparts in the United States to really remind everyone about how important this relationship is. I thought I would actually just share a bit of just what it is that we do and the kinds of the kind of information that that I share with whether it is at the federal level with the USTR and any of our cabinet colleagues on on the other side. But we've been crisscrossing America, all into all of the different states, certainly the ones that are big customers to Canada, to really promote and what we actually know, which is how deeply integrated our economies are,
on us,
and their dependence on us. So $3.6 billion. $3.6 billion a day is what crosses between Canada and US. So that's $150 million an hour. That's how much we do. So to give you the significance of that, and it's about 1.3 trillion, Canadian, American jobs that are tied to Canada is at 7.8 million. So when you break that down, like I did when I was in Texas, meeting with the governor of Texas, I was there with Canadian companies who are operating in Texas, Canadian investors who are operating in Texas, talking about the integration, the synergy, and what it is that we do together and why. And I remember the governor saying to me, Canada is the place that we trust doing business with. We share values as democracies. We know that we can count on you, and you can be trusted, and we trust each other, and that is a really, really important foundation for this relationship. But the sheet that I'm looking at here is really what we measure from this really important Team Canada exercise that Francois Philippe and I and Kirsten has been doing. We've had over 1,300 interactions and meetings across the United States, across all of the states, north, south, east, and west. And the message that really comes across, and the message that they sort of, play back to us, is really the value of this relationship, the criticality of the supply chain, and how Canada is dependable and reliable to them. And I remind them, we are your trusted partner to the north. We share a border that is 9,000 kilometers long, and our people work freely across our borders, and we've been doing this for a very, very, very long time.
I think that's right. And so I think, obviously we'll have to see, but I think this engagement is very important. I think Premier Ford is doing the same thing, I think, with governors as well, of the Great Lakes states and beyond. So I think there is this concerted effort to remind them that they rely on us, in many ways, as much as we rely on them. That may be the one thing that gives us safe harbor. We've run out of time, but we didn't get a chance to talk much about ASEAN. I know you've just come back from Laos. You're on your way to Indonesia, I think, next month, I think it is. Yes,
the Indonesia ambassador is here somewhere. There he is over there.
That's great.
And the Philippines. I'll be in
the Philippines. And big markets, big markets, and huge potential. Yeah. So
if I leave you with one thing, why ASEAN and why the Indo-Pacific? Canada is investing $2.3 billion in this strategy over the next 5 years. But ASEAN is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's 700 million people. It is the fastest growing region in the world. And Canada having presence there, and I've talked to a lot of Canadian companies because I've now taken hundreds of businesses to markets like Vietnam and Malaysia and Singapore, and of course to Philippines and to Indonesia. Next year we have a program that will finish the rest of the ASEAN countries. But Canadian companies will say, I ask why, and they will say it is a growing market. There are frontier markets, and there is real appetite for collaboration with Canada on digital, on green, on energy security, on just strong people-to-people relationships. I often say, look, Canadians, we're the best traders in the world. And the reason we're the best traders in the world is we come from around the world, and these bridges really do help us get really strong in not only that part of the world, but elsewhere. But ASEAN is very important. Indo-Pacific is very important. It's fast growing, and there's a real opportunity for Canadian businesses. And I see it because it's one thing for a trade minister to say, let me take a trade mission. It's another when hundreds come along and actually are doing business, courting investment, and ultimately growing together.
That's terrific. I think we're getting the hook, but terrific. Thank you very much. That was, I think, a really good sense of where we're at and where we're going on the trade scene. It's a critical portfolio. So congratulations for holding it as long as you have, which is really great. So thank you.
So infrastructure, I hope you guys enjoyed your lunch, because right now we're diving into a really exciting topic, infrastructure. There's so many new developments and innovations and so many threads to pull on. So let's just dive right head first into this, Macky. So starting off, I want to get your sense of the state of infrastructure development and some of the across North America, but particularly in Canada, some of the recent hurdles that we've been facing as far as developing infrastructure and finding the funding sources, especially as we're talking about this booming population to develop infrastructure for.
Well, we're at a very unique, exciting time in the space. As you know, we've been accumulating deficit on infrastructure over the last decades. And on top of that deficit, there is so much demand that is beginning to develop on secular trends we're facing. The most meaningful one is around energy transition. Our planet faces an existential threat. And to meet that threat, we need to really transition the world economy and Canada's economy to a low carbon one. And to do that, one of the key levers we have is succeed with the energy transition. And that word is being used in a broad sense. But what goes in there is much more solar energy, much more wind energy, much more storage of energy in the form of increasingly efficient performing batteries. It's developing an EV charging infrastructure. It's migrating to the newer technologies that exist but have to be improved, such as carbon capture and storage, such as green hydrogen, such as sustainable aviation fuel, such as biofuel. It's a long list. There is a lot to do. And really, we need to be able to do all of this to be able to be successful. And another area that is fueling meaningful investment, as you were mentioning, Stephanie, is around digital infrastructure. Why is that? Over the last many years, we've seen all sectors of the economy digitalizing their operation as a matter of necessity, as a matter of really efficiency. And that trend we've seen being accelerated during COVID and meaningful investment in that space. And we can dig a bit more in detail into the specifics of that. And of course, we've seen towards the back end of the pandemic, supply chain disruptions. And at the moment, with the world which had reached a stage where the global economy was very integrated, we're now seeing with some trade tension that some areas of the supply chain are being reshored back, are being separated, and that requires investment along the logistics, along the supply chain logistics, to make sure to continue to maintain efficient flows. And so you're talking about investment in things like ports, airports, rail infrastructure, all of the logistic chain. So it's a lot going on at the same time, and it does create stress on the amount, the magnitude, the sheer magnitude of capital investment required, around the resources required, around the skilled labor required, around the critical minerals. So there is a lot. And of course, trade tensions at the moment and tariffs don't help. So there are many challenges ahead of us to be able to really meet that challenge.
For sure, many challenges. It sounds like many opportunities as well. Then looking at Canada, how would you rate the country's ability to develop infrastructure like everything you described, airports, rail transit? How would you rate their ability to do it on budget and within the timeline they set out?
I think that I'm optimistic about Canada's position to capture that challenge and that opportunity. And I don't want to make it sound like an insurmountable mountain. You are right. I like the fact that you use the word opportunity. Why I think that Canada is uniquely positioned to grab that opportunity. Number one, it has to do with the fact, and there are a few factors, but we have world-class engineering and construction companies that are world leaders in all these areas I've been talking about. And so that's a key component to start with. If you look at the capital also, our private companies, our private investors, if you think about our pension funds, last night we were hearing, thanks to the conference, John Graham from CPPIB, which now manages 650 billion. I spent 16 years at CDPQ, which is nearing 450 billion. You have Omer, CPP, and those institutions are world renowned to be some of the most sophisticated investors in infrastructure. You add to that our banks. I was on a panel yesterday with the senior executive, Grégoire from BMO. Our banks also have the degree of sophistication. So those are elements, I think, that contribute to the skill set. What I would also add is energy itself. Canada has a lot of energy, and it has good energy expertise, the critical minerals we have. And there are also institutions at the government level which have been put in place over the years that are able to play a role, are playing a role, and that role has to be maintained and accelerated. A few examples, a Canada Infrastructure Bank. Was a recent setup, but they've already had an impact. Canada Growth Fund. If you think about Infrastructure Ontario, la Société Québécoise des Infrastructures, Partnership BC, those are all tools that are there and available and to be leveraged for that outcome. So I think the basis is there, but we have to be deliberate and very focused to succeed in the infrastructure challenge.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought the private sector into this because you mentioned some of the roles that they play. Do you have examples of some of the projects that private sector really help bring past the finish line there?
I do, and you touch on a critically important point, which is the role of private sector. And oftentimes you hear debate on public versus private sector, and I disagree with that debate about saying it's one or the other. If you think about the challenge government has, and by definition, governments, they have limited resources. They're coming out of the pandemic with record levels of debt to GDP for the reason that they had to keep economies in place. They had to keep money in people's pockets. So, it's not a criticism, it's just a fact. And so they have to support the infrastructure challenge. But on top of that, they have other competing important priorities. The health sector with an aging population, education, security. I mean, the list is long. And so for that reason, the private sector can come in and bring much needed additional capital, can bring much needed additional expertise, resources. And in my mind, the partnership between the public and private sector is a win-win one where more can be done more efficiently. And these are not just words. If I can, as you were asking, give two very concrete examples that I was personally involved with that showed that partnership, and it happens every day in Canada and around the world. One was in my previous role at CDPQ. The team under my leadership there at CDPQ Infra developed the largest public transit system in the province of Quebec in 50 years, the RAM project. 67 kilometers, operating 7 days a week, 20 hours a day, really transforming mobility around Montreal. Very impactful in the sense that that project will have a concrete impact on the environment, take cars out of the road, improve the carbon footprint, improve the quality of living of people living around Montreal. And this was done to get to shovel in the ground at one of the shortest pace around. And Bloomberg, very credible institution, made an analysis which I would encourage you to look into. And their conclusion on really that the RAM was that it was built at a cost of 139 million per mile. And they made a comparison on that cost with the most recent major comparable transit projects built in North America, in major cities in the US, and so on. And their conclusion was striking. The RAM cost per mile was somewhere between 30 to over 90% cheaper than all other comparable projects. So that is a concrete example and a win-win one for the population and for a critical infrastructure. Let me, if I may, give you a second example, which is the one project that my team in the US at Carlyle successfully developed. It's the largest public-private partnership ever done in the US in the transport sector. New Terminal 1 at JFK, developed during tough times at COVID when air traffic was down. The outcome is a $9.5 billion project. It's 50% built already, and soon will be serving a critical part of the U.S. economy and the international gateway of New York.
Absolutely, yeah. And also wanted to talk about the energy transition infrastructure, and I wanted to dive right into a topic that has come up quite a few times, nuclear infrastructure, because in recent months we saw that headline where 3 Mile Island, one of the reactors, will come back online by the end of the decade, which raised a few eyebrows. But and then more recently, you saw Amazon pledging some investments into small modular reactors. What does this next leg of the era of atomic energy look like? And what is nuclear's role in energy transition?
Well, Stephanie, I have to say that my eyebrows raised also when I heard that 3 Mile Island was going to be reactivated. Not that nuclear energy isn't part of the mix in the future, but as all of you know, 3 Mile Island was the site of one of the most significant nuclear incident in the US history, and it was a foul name for many years. But it shows the reality we face today, and it's an important point, which is that to succeed on energy transition, we have to understand that it's a road, it's a process, it will take time. And of course, we need to maximize investment in low carbon energy and in these new technologies, which include all the way to green hydrogen. But it's a mistake to think that this happens overnight with a flip of a switch. And so there is the importance to balance energy transition and energy security. Europe has learned this the hard way. Germany, one of the leaders in Europe in green energy, started shutting down their coal, their nuclear facilities, and it's really had a major impact on the German economy. And they've had to burn more coal than they ever had in the history, and now they're beginning to restart nuclear facilities. Sweden was one of the most committed governments against nuclear. They are having to reactivate their nuclear facilities. Post Fukushima in Japan, the Japan population and government were very strongly against nuclear. Their position has changed today because of energy security. And so, long answer to your question, I think that nuclear energy has to be part of the mix for the future. And it's particularly interesting in the sense that there is a new generation of nuclear technology, very different from the old one, which is modular nuclear reactor technology. And I think there is a benefit to get more informed, educated. And clearly, when I was mentioning earlier that Canada has, strong energy history and expertise, it goes from the fact that we have the traditional hydrocarbon in Western Canada. We have the meaningful renewable resources in Quebec with the hydroelectricity, and in Eastern Canada and Newfoundland. And of course, we have been a nuclear nation, and we have expertise with a number of existing facilities. And in an interesting way, I think the best way to summarize my perspective on this, and this is something we like to say at Carlyle, which is that we need to invest in the energy transition, not divest. So from that perspective, there has been a trend to divest from traditional energy, which generally doesn't solve the problem of lowering the carbon economy. I mean, if you sell a high carbon facility, but that facility continues to be used because it's needed, it's been removed from your books, but it's still out there, it's still generating. And, I think, and we think that what has to be done is to be responsible owners of these assets that are needed, including those that are sitting on the higher end of the carbon intensity, but then use the capital and expertise to put these assets onto a trajectory into the low carbon net zero economy and improve their performance and their footprint. And there you move the needle much more and you improve really the situation for the planet.
For sure. And it's interesting because I've heard from some business leaders describing Canada as having the potential to be the nuclear epicenter of the world. You see the nuclear power plant in Pickering, where I grew up. How does Canada really seize on this opportunity and, in your words, like really take off on this trajectory and take a part in this nuclear age here?
I think it's an important one. I think we'll have to be deliberate about it because the expertise is there. It will take, I think, government's focus also and openness. And I think it will vary from one region of Canada to the other because I think social acceptance of that technology remains very variable. If you go to, my province, Quebec, I think probably that's where the level of acceptance will be the lowest. I think Ontario has lived with it for many years, and so there will be nuances. But again, I think that the challenge we have to overcome to succeed with this challenge of a successful transition to a low carbon economy will mean that we will not be able to afford to put aside any of the promising technologies out there or any of the technologies that can bring us a solution. And I think from that perspective, nuclear has to be considered, assessed, and implemented where there is, of course, social acceptability, but on which I think we should have an open mind.
Absolutely. We only have a few minutes left, but I got to add a question about EVs here. Looking at EV infrastructure and charging stations, I remember the issue was that there weren't enough charging stations for the initial rollout of EVs. So what does that infrastructure look like moving forward? And is it still a priority when the consumer demand might be waning a little bit in certain areas?
Yes, great question. I think that EV is part of the solution in the long term. And a number of studies have shown that it's been a key factor to encourage a broader number of people to buy EVs, to have more of the EV charging infrastructure. Personally, I think it's more of a comfort factor than a necessity. I've been an owner of EV for many years, and I haven't used them as much, as long as I had the charge at the beginning, and I didn't do that many 500 or 1,000-kilometer trip. But people like that idea, and the newer generation of EV. Mine is double the size, but it is something that I think governments have to continue to invest into to provide that comfort for people to continue to use it independently of the distance. I think that the short-term break and impediment on the development of EV are economic conditions. Consumers have basically in North America held the economy. They've kept consuming, in part thanks to the savings they had during COVID, but they are at the moment getting exhausted. Credit card balances are up, and EV are more expensive. And so that's having an impact. And it's happening at the same time as governments also are having constraints, and we've seen them cutting back on their support financially for EV. And so that, I think, will have a short-term impact on the level of penetration of EV. And by the way, it's not being helped by the fact that to protect domestic industries, tariffs are being implemented at a heavy level on cheaper EVs coming from China. It's understandable, but then it has an impact on affordability. So I think that the momentum on EV will go back again when the economic conditions improve. But in the meantime, we might see a slowdown, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, talk about a sector that's just been hit on all sides, and it just keeps getting more challenging. But I could talk about infrastructure all day, but I know we're coming to time a little bit here. So I just wanted to really thank you for walking us through where Canada sits in this new world of infrastructure, the new developments in nuclear, and then, of course, that really engaging EV conversation and the private sector and the role that they play. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. This has been exciting, and enjoy the rest of the day.